this is the Digital Cluster Initiative's 4th workshop that we've put together for the Secular Otago wine cluster. So we're really pleased and grateful to Elise at MFAT and for accepting BNZ's invitation to speak today. So we're really looking forward to this informative session, and really appreciate your time to prepare and to share your knowledge with our group. So Elise Trewick, she is part of the Free Trade Implementation Unit, focusing on Southeast Asia FTAs, and has been with MFAT for 6 years, and prior to that was an analyst at the New Zealand Treasury. So thank you so much, Elise, for taking the time to join us today. We also welcome Jason Reeves, Head of Business Export at the BNZ. He's arranged this session for us, so thank you very much for teeing that up, Jason. It's really appreciated. Also, we have the 2 Digital Cluster Initiative sponsors for the wine cluster. David Kelly, he's co-founder and chairman at Zeald. Andrew Forsyth is the CEO at Zeald. I am the communications lead for the Digital Cluster Initiative team. Welcome, Jake. It's great to see you here today. GM for Kawa and the lead of this pilot group. So I will, before I hand over to Elise, perhaps Jason, you might have something further to add.
Sure. Hey, well, thanks everyone for joining. Good. I'm not on mute, so I managed to do it.
Well done.
Yeah, thanks for joining the call this morning. We're delighted to be working with our good friends at MFAT, and thanks, Elise. We've had a good relationship with the Auckland team prior, Caroline Bilke, who's now living the good life as ambassador in Paris, and now obviously the replacement, Rachel Maidman, out there in the Auckland office, and their team there have been very supportive of the cluster. In actual fact, Rachel actually worked on an actual coalition or cluster herself in a previous life before doing her current role now at MFAT. So she's really passionate about seeing enterprises collaborate, share their resources and insights, and put their best foot forward in international markets. So she's really keen to kind of embrace this. So we're keen to have Elise join us this morning for this morning's session to have a look at kind of FTAs from a 2 perspective. One, the kind of technical aspect, but more, I guess, from a business perspective, is how they can be utilised. Because I know, from my experience in the past, Jake, from my role previously in Japan, there were a number of occasions when businesses were actually unaware of the agreements they could utilise. So in some cases, they're actually paying more in tariffs than they actually were required to do so, because they weren't actually exercising the agreements that were in place. So if you can perhaps, I guess, through the course of the session this morning, at least, just, as I say, go through the kind of the application of the FTAs, and more importantly, I think, how we can actually apply those to businesses that want to use them to get a kind of, to reduce those kind of the tariff charges. And of course, that means ultimately more money on the bottom line, Jake. So with that, over to you, Elise.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to talk to you all this morning, and thank you so much for having me. As Janelle said, I'm part of MFAT's Free Trade Implementation Unit, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's a team that I thought it'd be useful to just sort of situate what I do in our broader sort of trade policy space. There's a lot of actors that work in this area, not just in MFAT, but our friends at New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, and all sorts of other organizations as well. My team was established about a year ago, sort of in response to the fact that New Zealand now has this huge number of trade agreements, especially just with the EU one just being concluded. That's sort of pretty much the sort of raft of main trade agreements that we wanted to target are now concluded, which is a pretty incredible thing to be able to say at this point. Certainly not that the work is done at that point, of course, but we have a lot of colleagues that work on the negotiation side, but yeah, realizing that actually now we have all these agreements in place, how do we really leverage them? And how do we make sure that once we've signed on the dotted line, they're actually still meaningful and they're doing what we wanted them to do? And beyond just that, a lot of my role is working with really down in the detail of these agreements and the provisions, and making sure that the technical side is working well, but also really reaching out to business and making sure people are aware, as you're saying, Jason, making sure people know about these agreements, how to use them, what sectors they're working in. And I was just in Auckland last week really briefly and catching up with our Auckland office, and Rachel, it was really interesting and useful to hear, that message that there's a lot of businesses out there that would love to know more about this and how this actually ties into the work they do. So it's a real pleasure to do these kinds of engagements. And as I go through the presentation, please ask questions, and afterwards, if you have any feedback about any areas that you think it would be useful for us to do more outreach on or provide more information, always really open to hear that, because business are the ones that are really out there doing the mahi, and we need to know kind of what's useful. So just a little introduction from me. I'm going to try and be technologically able and share my presentation. Let's see how this goes.
You can do it.
Thanks for the face. Hopefully it wants to work. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right, as I say, please jump in with questions along the way. No need to wait. And if there's any particular areas that I'm skating over that you think would be useful for me to touch more on, please do let me know. I thought it'd be useful just to give an introduction in terms of what I'll cover off today, just of what MFAT does in the trade space, and sort of how, very briefly, how we fit into that sort of wider trade policy landscape. What is trade policy? Why does it matter? I'm sure a lot of you are already pretty familiar with that. What is a free trade agreement, and what is our sort of range of FTAs looking like? And finally, what can we do to help, and what tools do we have available to support people to use these agreements? So just really briefly, in terms of Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or Te Manatu Aorere, we represent New Zealand internationally, obviously on the foreign affairs and foreign policy side and the trade side. We project New Zealand's values and secure the outcomes that matter to New Zealand. We also have a really important role in our posts out there in the world. Over 50 of them have a really important role in letting MFAT and other agencies in the government know what's going on, what are the trends that we're seeing. In terms of our purpose, we act in the world to make a safer, more prosperous and more sustainable future for New Zealand. And obviously the Treaty of Waitangi is a really important framework that sets up how we go about that. Our role in trade. So MFAT leads on the development and implementation of New Zealand's trade policy. Obviously, we don't do that in isolation. We work really closely with other government agencies, other entities, and of course, try and reflect what we're hearing from business and other interest groups. A big part of our role is to negotiate and implement free trade agreements, really kind of getting down into the detail. But we also have a really important role in sort of looking across what are the trends we're seeing, what are the market access issues that businesses are actually facing beyond, just the words on the page of the trade agreement. We also have an important role in trying to shape the wider landscape the trade is happening in. So I'm sure you might have seen, over the last few years in the news, some of the challenges that we're having in terms of supporting the World Trade Organization, for example. So those sorts of trends are concerning, and pushing back against that and projecting New Zealand's interests is a really important part of the work that we do. And finally, growing New Zealanders' incomes, job opportunities, and living standards. So why does trade matter? I'm sure a lot of this will be, very familiar to all of you. New Zealand is a hugely trade dependent economy. But at the same time, we're also, right at the sort of bottom corner of the world, pretty isolated from a lot of the major markets that we try and trade with, which I'm sure, you've all got firsthand experience of. So ensuring that our trade settings and the actual frameworks that we put in place to govern that is really important. We have a lot to do with, the World Trade Organization and those types of norm setting institutions. And while it can sound a bit bureaucratic, they are really important in making sure that when it actually comes down to it and we're looking to trade, we have those settings right to make that happen as effectively as possible. 1 in 4 jobs in New Zealand are dependent on exports, which is a really huge number. And obviously during COVID, that's been sort of the challenges of that come with that have been quite exposed, which is why trade has really been at the forefront of the government's economic recovery strategy from COVID. Makes up around 60% of our economic activity. And in particular, in the Māori economy, trade is hugely important, as I'm sure you'll be aware, particularly in the primary industry, but beyond that as well. And trade is a really important part of the government's wider goal of a productive, sustainable and inclusive economy that will be net carbon zero by 2050. So yeah, it really isn't something that we can underestimate the importance of trade. In terms of what is a free trade agreement, now hopefully I'm not going to be teaching you to suck eggs here, but just in terms of what are some of the sort of key components that we look at. Obviously at its heart, it's a set of rules for how we trade with each other. But the kind of key components that can include, number one, a reduction or an elimination of tariffs. And that's probably one of the main sort of headline aspects that often, gets reported on and focused on, and it is really important. It can have a really immediate impact if one day you're sending a product and you're paying X dollars of a tariff, and the next day you don't have to pay that. That's a really immediate benefit. And the UK and EU FTAs that we've just signed have really significant gains in that area, particularly in the wine sector. But there's a whole range of other things that we can achieve through our FTAs. Intellectual property protection, product standards is really important, both for imports and exports. Procurement, this is something that we've heard quite a lot from businesses, that is a sort of growing part often of what business are looking to do. Services, I think a lot of companies in New Zealand that do services, whether that's tourism, education, professional services, don't always think of themselves as exporters, but they absolutely are. And so these trade agreements can be incredibly valuable in terms of making it easier to do business abroad, and making sure that when you do that, you are going to be treated fairly, and there's not going to be sort of, red tape slapped on you that makes it really difficult or really inefficient to do that. And yeah, finally, fair treatment for investors. So, that's another really important area where we need to make sure that we've got really clear governance for how investors from New Zealand are treated. So yeah, there's a huge range of things that we can look at.
Elise, with the IP protection component, can you maybe just expand on that a little bit of what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will caveat by saying not my area of expertise, but I think particularly as sort of digital trade has expanded a lot, this is an increasingly important area of our trade agreements. And so there's a kind of a range of different provisions that can be put in place to do this. But I think really our focus at the moment is making sure that in the digital space, particularly an example that's come up recently is with Mataranga Māori, and making sure that taonga and that kind of thing are protected. So it can be quite difficult to enforce these sorts of protections, but it's really about making sure that our partner governments that we are trading with are prepared and to enforce those sort of IP protections that we put in place. I'm afraid I don't have a hugely detailed background in this particular area, but I'm really happy to talk to my colleagues that do, if you had some more detailed questions.
Yeah, my sense is that I guess it's just each country is agreeing to sort of honour the intellectual property rights that exist in the other country. Is that kind of a correct understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that I think our understanding of what intellectual property is evolving as well. So for example, one of the agreements that I work on, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it's quite a long title. That was our first trade agreement, as far as I'm aware, that put in specific recognition of traditional and indigenous knowledge as being a type of intellectual property that merits protection, for example. So yeah, it's a really important area, and probably actually is broader than one might think.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, David, to not have a more detailed response for you on that question, on what that can look like.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's fine. Awesome. Thank you.
So looking at our range of free trade agreements, as I was saying before, we've sort of actually achieved a huge amount in the last few years in terms of really expanding the portfolio of agreements that we have. We now have, I think, 12 free trade agreements. I can do a quick count. 13 that have been concluded with the EU. 11 of them are now in force. So on the left, we have the leftmost box. We have over here, we have our bilateral trade agreements. So those are our ones that are just with one other country. They're, as you can see, really focused in Asia, which is obviously a huge market for New Zealand. Some of these trade agreements, Australia, Singapore, for example, China, have been around, for 20 plus years. So they're pretty mature and really well established at this point. We do go through processes of reviewing and upgrading our trade agreements, because obviously something you signed 20 years ago isn't necessarily going to reflect how we do business today, particularly in the e-commerce and digital space. So the China FTA, for example, this year was just upgraded. Singapore was also upgraded, I think 3 years ago. Then the next category we have that are in force are our sort of bigger multilateral or plurilateral agreements. So they're with larger groups of countries. And the ones that I work on are the ASEAN Australia New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, which is also one of our older ones. It's about 12 years old now. And maybe I'm biased, but I think one of our most important ones. It's probably one of our most wide-ranging free trade agreements that we have. The Southeast Asia states collectively are our third biggest market, and I think while not necessarily one of the biggest markets for the wine sector in particular, at the current moment, definitely a growing market, as that sort of region is really expanding economically so quickly. Just begun absolutely chucking it down with rain outside my window. Hopefully it's not too loud on your street. Classic Wellington weather. Just to touch on a couple of other ones, the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, not the snappiest title, is one that probably people are quite sort of aware of because of the media coverage of its predecessor sort of incarnation of the TPP. But that's probably one of our highest quality trade agreements in terms of the market access that it provides. And I'll just touch on RCEP as well, which came into force this year. It's the biggest free trade agreement in the world. It's pretty revolutionary in terms of some of the things it does in trade facilitation, which I'll touch on a little bit later, what that actually means in practice. These two here that are concluded but not yet in force, I think are probably of most interest to this market, the UK and the EU. So they've now been signed, but yeah, they still have to obviously go through the legislative process to actually come into force and be operationalized. And then finally, we have a couple under negotiation. We're currently upgrading the agreement that we have with Australia and ASEAN. That should be concluded later this year. Big focus of that is making sure that it really reflects a lot of the sort of digital and e-commerce trade that we're currently seeing. Obviously is hugely different to when we signed that agreement back in, I think it was 2010. So that should be a really significant step forward. And we're in the early stages of looking at an agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Is there any sense of when those negotiations are likely to be concluded, or are they something that can just take any length of time?
Yeah, it can be really difficult, I think, to predict. The one that I was referring to before, for example, RCEP and RCEP, took, I think, the best part of 10 years to negotiate. So it really can vary. Hopefully that won't be the case. The upgrade of the Australia ASEAN one should be concluded by the end of this year. Okay. It will then have to go through the legislative process, but it should all hopefully be wrapped up pretty quickly. The one with the GCC is really in its early stages at the moment, really, really early on. So I think it would be difficult to say what time period we'd be looking at, but yeah, it probably isn't in the immediate future that we'd be looking at concluding that one.
Yep. And I think if I can just jump in here, Elise, I think to your question, David, in terms of the ratification process, I think with the UK FTA, we're kind of hopeful that will be a reasonably kind of quick process, in the sense that you're only dealing with one other partner, and kind of the UK now going it alone after being in the EU for many, many years has to kind of demonstrate to its own constituents that the value of exiting Brexit by concluding and ratifying FTAs. So you kind of would imagine they'd be keen to get on with it.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, good. That's helpful. Yeah, it's just good to get a sense as to whether some of these things are 5-10 years away, or 6-12 months, 24 months away. You know, whether you're talking those sort of timeframes or a far bigger time frame.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as Jason said, in the case of those we've recently signed, definitely a priority, both for MFAT and for the sort of big G government to get those through as quickly as possible, so that we can start seeing those benefits put into practice. And my sense is that's shared on both sides. I thought I'd briefly touch on just some of the sort of other kind of components that we focus on in our trade agreements. One of those that I think it's really important to highlight is the government's Trade for All agenda. And what this is that sort of in response to some of the challenges that we've had in the last couple of years with some of our trade agreements, and concerns sort of growing in New Zealand about aspects of our trade agenda, making sure that our trade policy really does reflect New Zealanders' interests, and that it actually does support all New Zealanders to benefit from trade. And we talk a lot about the importance of sustainable and inclusive economic development. So in response to that, MFAT conducted a review of our trade policy, and there was a lot of public engagement and public consultation that happened as part of that process. And a series of recommendations were put together and put to the government for consideration for us to take forward. One of the really important parts that, you know, unsurprisingly came out of that is the importance of understanding and reflecting Māori interests in our trade agenda. And there's, you know, certainly not something that you can really ever say is done and finished. It's a really ongoing process of making sure that we are really building and developing those relationships and ensuring that we are doing the outreach and doing the mahi to really reflect that. So one example is the UK FTA that we really recently signed. Has a specific Māori trade and economic cooperation chapter, which is really exciting. It was something that was really, you know, a priority for this negotiation, and it contains the broader set of outcomes for Māori that we've negotiated in an FTA to date. More broadly than that, we're always looking for opportunities to reflect sustainability and inclusivity in our FTAs. So, for example, the upgrade of our ASEAN free trade agreement that I was just speaking about before, we have agreement from our partners to include a specific chapter, to include specific provisions on trade and sustainable development. So we'll work with those countries to cooperate in areas like ensuring that we're supporting environmental protection through trade, we're supporting labor standards, those types of issues that previously might not necessarily have been seen, you know, so much in the purview of trade agreements, but actually trade and enterprise has such a big impact on those areas. So it's really important that we're putting those at the forefront of our trade agenda. Considering that we're talking about the digital clusters, I thought it'd be useful to briefly touch on some of our digital trade provisions. There's a huge range of different digital provisions that we might look at in our various trade agreements, depending on the context, but some of those include things like paperless trading, e-invoicing, online consumer protection, ensuring that our governance frameworks, both in New Zealand and in our partner countries, are working effectively. I think when we do think a lot about the sort of the costs of, you know, sending a physical product from one place to another, even in those cases where you're not necessarily an exporter of a digital service, you can still really benefit from digital trade provisions. It has so much potential to really make it cheaper, more efficient to do the actual trading, you know, whether that's sort of making customs processes more streamlined through using digital, those types of things can be really important. The UK FTA, this was a really big focus, digital trade was. So for example, yeah, we've got paperless trading, so using using online means to facilitate trade in customs processes and that kind of thing, protecting the rights of businesses and consumers, and promoting innovation and economic growth through cooperation in areas like digital inclusion. So trying to make sure that those benefits are sort of realized by more marginalized groups as well, and taking advantage of emerging technologies. I think part of this as well is trying to, as much as we can, future-proof some of these agreements, because as I was saying before, you know, when you do negotiate an agreement after a number of years, it can become a little bit outdated in some areas. So I think looking forward to what are the trends we're seeing is a really important part of making sure that we're really reflecting the sort of modern business environment in those FTAs. Touching briefly on what does our export profile actually look like, I'm sure a lot of this won't be news to the audience, but New Zealand, obviously, as I was saying before, is a trade dependent economy. In 2021, despite the impacts of COVID and disruption to supply chains and that type of thing, we still exported $77 billion of goods and services, which is just absolutely staggering, I think, in that context. And $63 billion of that was goods. Our services exports have been particularly disrupted by COVID. In areas like tourism, obviously, flights have and travel restrictions have really impacted that. So we're hopeful that will begin to rebound now that the world is sort of somewhat going back to normal in that regard.
And just a quick note on that, you see that that remaining 14 billion of exports or services, to Elise's point, very few foreign language students studying in New Zealand, very few tourists, but that's predominantly through the tech sector, which has grown remarkably in the last kind of 12 years. And it's now actually our third largest kind of export vertical. And if you can, what's written in the TIN 100, something in the region of $9 billion of export revenue from a tech sector. So it's grown remarkably, exacerbated through benefited through COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's sort of a cliche but true that difficult times sort of do sometimes foster that innovation, and I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the response of some, New Zealand sectors to the challenge of COVID have been really incredible in terms of the innovation and sort of resilience that we've seen. But yeah, some of our traditional export sectors in particular have suffered. In 2021, we exported, I didn't know this before putting this presentation together, but almost $2 billion of wine, which is pretty significant growth compared to just 7 years ago, when you do sort of factor in the disruption that we've seen in the last couple of years. Overall, our top 5 goods export destinations, there are probably no surprises in that graph on the left. China obviously is the most significant market, followed by Australia, where we have really open trading conditions, one of our closest economic partners, our closest economic partner in that regard. But obviously quite a different profile to when you look at specifically the wine export destinations, where the USA, where we actually don't have a free trade agreement, is by far the largest export destination, followed by the UK, Australia, Canada, and Germany. And the other 4 of which we now do have FTAs with. So looking specifically at the wine sector in our FTAs, as I was just saying, the 4 of those top 5 markets, we now do have FTAs to cover, which is really fantastic. So of our FTAs that are now in force, tariffs have been completely eliminated in 7 markets, and quite a few of our other markets where they haven't been eliminated altogether, they've still been significantly reduced, including in the Southeast Asian countries. The UK and EU FTAs will entirely eliminate tariffs on wine upon entry into force, which I think will be, hugely significant. In the UK, I understand we export around $500 million of wine per year, and there's currently I think it's a $50 per hectolitre tariff, and that will be removed. In the EU case, I'm not sure about volumes off the top of my head, sorry, but I do know that there was I think around 30-40 euro tariff on per hectolitre, and the removal of that is expected to save around $5.5 million in tariffs per year. So it's pretty significant benefits. But as I was saying before, I think, we do really focus on those immediate savings through tariff reduction, which, can't be overstated how significant they are. But at the same time, the other provisions that we get through our FTAs are really helpful to exporters as well. So reducing the cost and the administrative burden of trading. I've never had to go through these processes myself, but hearing from businesses about, the processes of declaration of origin and, meeting those requirements are so burdensome for a lot of businesses, especially small businesses, to navigate those processes. So I think anything we can do to make those simpler is really beneficial, making that customs process and export process simpler. And also under the UK FTA, we've secured, under the EU FTA, we've secured recognition and protection of certain New Zealand winemaking practices, which again is a sort of less immediate benefit, but still really important for the industry. I'll just pause there. I thought this might be an area in particular where there might be some questions, but.
Yeah, I was going to ask, so the tariffs, you mentioned that there was no tariffs in Japan or the UK and low tariffs in the Southeast Asia free trade agreements. Did you happen to know what the tariffs are for Southeast Asia? I'm unfamiliar with those.
I'm not sure entirely off the top of my head, sorry, Jake, but I can definitely get back to you offline if that would be helpful. I do know that in quite a number of markets of the 10 Southeast Asian countries, we've almost entirely reduced tariffs, I think, to about 99% tariff-free. So, but I'm not sure specifically on wine, but I can definitely get back to you on the specifics. I believe, but I'm not certain about this, but I believe that there might be some challenges with some of the markets due to restrictions on alcohol. So there are, sort of cultural nuances there as well, that might impact what we're able to achieve with our partners in terms of reducing tariffs. But yeah, I'd be really happy to get back to you on the specifics of that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know just what those tariffs are from my own point of view. But I suppose the follow-on question is around the non-tariff areas that you mentioned there, in particular labeling requirements. Do you happen to know much about labeling requirements going into some of these countries that we have FTAs with in particular? Well, actually, it'd be interesting to know if there's anything in the EU FTA that mentions those sorts of things.
Sorry, I'm afraid I don't off the top of my head, Jake. Sorry to not be more help, but again, I would really love to talk to our EU team and let you know. I do know that labeling requirements is something that we do, that MFAT is really aware of as being a real challenge, and comes up quite often as what we call a non-tariff barrier as well. For trade, so something that doesn't fit neatly into the category of tariffs, but still creates a lot of extra costs. So yeah, I definitely can get back to you on the EU specifically and more generally on the wine sector, sort of how those labeling requirements might be addressed.
Thanks so much. Naturally, New Zealand wine growers are keeping us updated on those things as well. But I mean, with the EU FTA, but it would be helpful to know when you get a chance. Thanks so much.
No problem. Let's quickly make a note of that. Well, on a related note, I thought I'd sort of finish off, and happy to take any other questions after this, with some of the tools that we have, and actually jumping to the bottom of this list, where we have our tariff finder. So that is a really incredible resource where you can go in and type in any country or any product code, and it will come up in hopefully a pretty accessible means of what the tariff you pay. And it also compares our different trade agreements. So if you take Southeast Asia, for example, we do have, in some of those countries, we have 3 different trade agreements with one country. So you can look at your product and decide that's actually the best one for me to use. So hopefully that is a really useful resource. It's one that we try and publicize as much as we possibly can, because I think, like you were saying before, Jason, people don't always know which trade agreements to use or how to use them, and this is just a really practical way to try and support exporters to get the most benefits. In terms of other tools that we have, the first one on the list, requesting support with a trade barrier. So this is a really important part of the service that MFAT tries to give to our export community, where you're encountering those things that are not sort of strictly in the purview of a trade agreement, but definitely are a non-tariff barrier. So for example, it might be putting sort of quite arbitrary sizing requirements or labeling requirements, or putting quotas in place when those haven't been sort of agreed to or are outside the provisions of our trade agreements. We really want to hear about those things, because we might not immediately be able to solve it, but as soon as it's on our radar, the better we're able to sort of begin to put a plan together and look at how we might be able to address that. We have had some success stories. They don't always move incredibly quickly, but they can do. So earlier this year, I think about a month ago, we were able to work with Onions New Zealand, the industry group, to get rid of a requirement that the Thai government had just slapped onto onion imports that were basically crippling the export market there. And so through our post network, we were able to negotiate with the government to get them to remove that, and exports are then able to resume. So it can have really practical benefits, but we do really rely on our business community to work with us to make sure that we know about those. We also provide market intelligence services. So we've got market reports, we've got supply chain reports. We always get really fantastic sort of intelligence and reporting from our posts around the world. And so passing on that insight to our business community is really important part of what we try and do. We're obviously not the only organization doing that. There's so many great resources out there. New Zealand Trade and Enterprise has some really good market reporting. There's all kinds of different business councils and different foundations that offer those services as well, depending on what market you're looking at. So always please feel free to get in touch and ask us about that. I think one thing to really emphasize is that we're aware that who to ask your questions is not always the easiest thing. And I've heard that from business a lot, that, you know, you might have a question, but you actually don't know who to ask, or you go to one organization and are told, oh, that's not our responsibility. So we really try to operate a no wrong door policy. So if you come to us in MFAT and we don't know the answer, we'll do our best to put you in touch with someone that does, or get you an answer. We've got a pretty strict turnaround time in terms of responding to questions. So we're trying to be as sort of customer focused as we can. So yeah, please do always feel free to reach out to that exports email address if you have any questions, concerns, anything at all, and we will put you in touch with the right person. And
Jake, just to follow up what Elise was saying, we get those market reports and supply chain reports. They're very, very useful, given the fact that, you know, for the most part, we haven't been able to get to market for the previous 2 years. So to get regular updates of what's happening on the ground is really quite useful. And it's also they give quite a good domestic focus. So what are the current insights in the EU or in the UK, for argument's sake? They do things like consumption patterns, etc., which is really quite useful for exporting businesses. So you know, you might want to take note of those email addresses and get put on the distribution list. And I think they come out regularly, like every 2 or 3 weeks or so. You'll get an email that's written, and they're very useful.
Thanks.
Yeah, and in the market that I work on, specifically Southeast Asia, I know that, for example, the ASEAN New Zealand Business Council, NZT, the Asian New Zealand Foundation, they all have really great market reporting. Yeah, exactly about that. You know, what products are more in demand, what sectors are growing, which can be incredibly useful. And I'm certain there'll be equivalents for other regions like Europe, the UK, and the US. So those resources are definitely out there. And yeah, if you do need support finding them, please just let us know.
Yeah. And the other point also, Jake, obviously it depends on the markets that you're concentrating on, but we've also found actually the FTAs, actually we find the largest single benefit is not actually the reductions in tariffs themselves, although that's very useful. It's actually many exporters are now considering markets they haven't considered in the past. That's actually been what's been the largest win? It's that, well, that's always been the too hard basket, too difficult, we won't bother going there. That's been the biggest change of narrative, particularly with things like CPTPP. It's, okay, we'll have a look at that market now. We hadn't considered it in the past. And that may be a consideration for your coalition down there in Central Otago. Particularly, I think, as Elise mentioned, with both the EU and the UK agreements, some sectors do better than others. That's the nature of it. But certainly, the wine sector did very well out of both agreements.
Yeah, indeed. EU and the UK are sort of tentative markets for Central Otago wines, at least, just because there's heavy competition in those markets for high-end Pinot Noir. Yeah.
Hey, a question for you, not directly related to the immediate presentation, but do you put it, is Canada one of your target markets? And I only say that in the sense that it's while it's quite challenging in the sense that every province has got their own kind of regulations, it's actually a very high yielding market. Has that been a consideration of your cluster?
Well, going into Canada with alcohols is a little bit tricky because they have the liquor licensing board that do all of the purchasing for the entire country, and so to get a wine sort of past them is challenging, and usually the purview of large wineries. And so in Central Otago, we tend not to have that sort of critical mass of wine to be able to negotiate with them. So it's not a large target market for us down here, but it is a significant market for Marlborough, from what I understand.
Sure.
So I had one other question for you, Elise, just around environmental protections. Obviously, every country in the world at the moment is going at a slightly different pace in terms of how they're implementing environmental protections with regards to climate change, but also, reaching carbon zero goals and sustainability goals, etc. With free trade agreements, are there any kind of fish hooks that require us to meet certain standards in order to get to those international markets, in particular with wine? Or is that
it's a really good question. I think a lot of the environmental provisions that we see, or that we're looking at and have negotiated in our FTAs sort of more recently, have been more focused on what's the word I'm looking at? Sort of aspiration rather than necessarily strict requirements, is my understanding. And so we're kind of moving in the right direction, but some of our partners that we do negotiate with don't necessarily have the mandate to commit to legal requirements when it comes to environmental protections. And so we're looking at ways to focus on what we call opportunities for cooperation rather than sort of strict treaty requirements in our FTAs, that do put, sort of legally binding environmental requirements on producers and that kind of thing. So I'm not sure about, I feel like I'm apologizing a lot for not knowing the detail of these questions, but it is just sort of the nature of there's so many agreements that we work across, it's difficult to be across the detail of all of them. But I'm not sure about the specific detail of the EU and the UK, but and I can definitely double check that. But my sort of understanding is, it's more in that cooperation and commitment space rather than very detailed, strict enforcement of requirements.
Okay, so largely non-regulatory stuff, just aspirations, as you say.
Yes, that's my understanding, but please let me confirm.
That'll be good. That's all the questions I have for now. Thanks.
What I can also do is just following this call is just compile a few of these key questions that have come up into a bullet point, and I can just follow up with you, Elise, as well, if that's useful. And
absolutely.
Circle back on some of these, some of the information or answers, if that works.
Yeah, and if you think of any more questions, please do feel free to fire them through by email as well. Really happy to give you as much information as possible.
Thanks so much. I suppose one last thing I just wanted to check, if we're going to share this video with our own members, could we perhaps share it a little wider with the rest of the wine industry in New Zealand?
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine with me. I'm happy to send through the slides as well, if that would be helpful.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I'll pass it all on to New Zealand wine growers and let them do what they will with it.
Great.
Thanks so much.
So I can coordinate all of this between you all to get this working. The recording, the slides, I'll do the cover offs, I'll follow up with some of the questions and bullet points and all of the rest, and we can just put together a wee package that is easy to use.
Yeah, and the final sort of plug I was just going to make was we are sort of now, we're not past COVID as such, but sort of things are somewhat returning to normal. We're looking to resume some of our more in-person engagement and outreach. So we've kind of tended to focus a lot of that on Auckland and Wellington, but we're really keen to hear if there's interest in us doing some of those sort of road shows and those type of engagements that we do, whether that's sort of presentations or just a sit down for a chat with some of our key industries. So if there was interest for us to do that, beyond those sort of traditional centres, we'd really like to hear if that would be useful. I know some of our partner organisations are really good at getting around the country a bit more and sort of talking to people, and it's nice to be able to do that in person. As much as it's great to have the option to do Zoom, sometimes you can't really replace a sort of face-to-face chat. So yeah, if you do think that would be of interest, please do let me know.
Will do.
Cool, thank you. Thank you so much, Elise, for that. That was super interesting and really useful. And I'm happy to circle back and coordinate with you as follow-up as well. But it's just so we're so grateful to have the support and input from MFAT, especially at the beginning of the journey of the Digital Cluster Initiative. So thank you very much for that. And there's nothing like knowledge sharing to bring everybody up together, especially at these early stages. So thank you so much for that. I'm not sure, David or Andrew, if you have anything further to add before we close today.
Yeah, thank you, Elise. That's been really helpful, and I think that's going to be really good for guiding the discussion that's coming up, which is around target markets and so on. That's a part that we've got coming up in terms of our workshops that lie ahead. And so this is going to be really good because it gives us a far, I think, deeper understanding of what markets are going to be more likely to be on that list, and what are going to be a whole lot easier to really enter as well. So yeah, it's been good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And Jason, I'm not sure if you have anything further to add at this point.
Hey, no, I just read out the earlier comments. Thanks, Elise. Really useful to get those an overview of of the agreements and how they can be utilised, and also. As I say, Jake, I think Janelle will send out a pack with detail into today's conversations, but those two, as I mentioned earlier, those supply chain reports and market reports, they're really, really useful. So, I suggest you might want to share those with your cohort, with your colleagues, because it provides some great market insights. And there have actually been specific ones on wine. So some of them are general, but some of them are on much specific sectors, including wine, for argument's sake. Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I think we'll close that there unless there's anything else to share. But yeah, again, thank you so much for your time, and to everybody for dialing in today. And we'll look forward to being able to share this wider as well with the group.
Great.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.